What's good, everybody? In this video, I'm going to show y'all all the music theory that you're going to ever need as a music producer. I'm going to show you pretty much everything I know about music theory that I've learned over the years making beats. So with that being said, stick all the way through to the end and let's just jump right into it. So the first thing I want to talk about are scales. In this video, I'm only going to talk about minor scales. Pretty much the rest of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be based in this. So understanding this is really helpful for pretty much everything else I'm going to discuss. So starting off with a minor scale, I'm just going to go up to the stamp up here, scroll down to minor natural or Aeolian, and I'm going to drop this on the C note. So this group of notes you're seeing here is a minor scale. A scale is a grouping of notes that creates a key. So if somebody says this song or beat is in the key of D minor, all that means is that the notes being used in that song are these right here. And a minor scale consists of 7 different notes and is constructed by creating spacing like this. So you start with your root note. On the screen right now, I have the root note of C. You're going to skip 2 spots on the piano roll or a whole step for your second note. Then you place another note 1 half step or 1 piano roll slot above it. Then you do another whole step, another whole step, half step, and a whole step, and then a whole step between the 7th note and the 1st note in the scale. And so I'm going to be mentioning numbers a lot in this video, and all that means is the relative note in the scale. So for C minor right here, if I say the 5th note in the scale, I'm just talking about G, and how I came up with that is just counting up in numerical order. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5th note is G. Another example would be the 7th note. So I count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The 7th note will be A sharp. And all of these rules are true for every single minor scale. Even if I move this down to G sharp minor, the way you make the scale is the same, which means like the note spacing here is the same. So this just means if you're making a beat and if you just want to change the scale, all you have to do is shift it accordingly on the piano roll. So say I make a melody in C minor and I want to put it up to E minor. All I have to do is move it up 4 half steps, and now I will have all my notes in E minor. And you'd have to do this for every melodic pattern. Also, if you want to see the scale across different octaves, what you could do is select it, shift click to copy it, and then you're just going to move this C up to the next C up here. And then same thing, you're just going to take that same C and move it to the next C below it. So if you want a method to view your minor scale while you're making beats and just to make it easier while you're still learning the different scales, there's a couple ways to do that in FL. So the first method involves using these notes. So let's say I have the C minor scale here across 3 different octaves. I'm just going to stretch the notes for, let's say, 8 measures in a empty sampler track so it doesn't make any noise. And then I can open up another piano roll and it'll show in the ghost notes, so I know where all my notes need to go. So if I want to make a melody, I could just do something like this. Another way of doing it is going up to the top left here, clicking on it, and then going to view, going down to scale highlighting, going down to minor natural, right clicking on that, and then selecting the root note. So for the sake of the last example, I'll just choose C again. It's kind of subtle, but you can see that all of these light gray notes in the piano roll are all the notes that are in the C minor scale. So if I put all these notes in, you can see that it's accurate with the other method too of using the stamp up here and pulling the scale down. So the main takeaways from the scale is that that's going to be the notes that you're using to make your melody. And if you use notes outside of that, it's probably not going to sound good with the rest of your beat. And if you're making a sample or a beat and you want to shift to a different key, all you have to do is just shift your notes the same amount up or down to fit that respective key. Here's a quick way that you can shift between the different keys with all your melodies without having to go into each one and shifting it a certain amount. If you go to your channel rack here, I have a couple melodies that I just penciled in. Say I want to move this from C sharp minor to F minor. Instead of having to go to each of these and moving it up, all I have to do is select both of these by using right click, go to this drop down menu in the top left, and then go to transpose selected, and I do +4. Plus or minus indicates if you're moving it up or down on the piano roll. The number that goes with it is the number of piano roll slots or piano keys that you're moving it. So now if I go into it, it'll have both my melodies at F minor. And this is really helpful if you have more than 2 or 3 melodies that it's going to take a while to move up or down. So now that we got the minor scale, the next thing I want to cover is building chords. I'm going to go back up to the stamp tool here and get my minor natural scale. I'm going to put this on D minor for the sake of this example. So using the minor scale, I'm just going to show you how you can make chords. The most basic chord that you can make is a minor chord. So I'm going to start with a root note of D. All I'm going to do to make this chord is I'm going to place 3 different notes, and I'm going to place a note on every other note in the scale. So I'm going to go up to the next scale degree, E. I'm going to skip that one and place a note on F. Then I'm going to skip G and then place a note on A. And this is going to make my basic minor chord, or D minor. So this is a basic minor chord. If you don't have the scale lit up behind it, what you could do is just remember that the second note is 3 half steps above the root note, and then the last note is 7 half steps from the root note or 4 half steps from the middle note. And if you want to make another chord in this same key but for a different root note, the same rules apply where you just put a note on every other scale degree. So let's say for example I wanted to make a note with a root note of A, so I'd put the first note on A, then I'd skip A sharp and put one on C, skip D and then put one on E. Now I have an A minor chord. Now let's say I wanted to put it on a root note like A sharp, so I'd place it on A sharp, then D, and then F. This is an A sharp major chord, and you can kind of tell just by the sound of it, it sounds happier than a minor chord. So if I move this chord up next to D minor, you can tell the only difference between a minor and a major chord is that this middle note is just moved up 1 half step. So the rule of making the chord without the scale is flipped. The first and the second note in the chord are 4 half steps apart. The middle note and the top note are 3 half steps apart, but the root note and the top note are still 7 half steps apart. So even if you're using a minor scale, you can still come up with major chords depending on the root note that you're using. But overall, as long as you skip every other note, you will come up with a chord and key as long as you stick with the scale. So now I'm going to cover some basic chord types, just building off of minor chord of the root note. So the first common variation that I see of this, especially in darker beats, is we take this middle note and drop it a half step to the second note in the scale. This is what we call a suspended chord. To be more specific, a suspended 2 chord, because we're moving it from the 3rd scale degree to the 2nd scale degree. And this has a more darker or mysterious type of tone to it. Comparing that to the original, another type of suspended chord is a suspended 4 chord, which just involves moving this to the 4th note in the scale. It kind of has that more mysterious vibe to it as the other one, but the suspended 2 definitely has a darker vibe to it. The next one that I've seen, I might be wrong, but I believe this is called the first inversion of a chord, where you take the top note and you drop it an octave. Another type of chord that is commonly used is called the 7th chord, and it's kind of self-explanatory, where we're just taking the root note here and we're just counting up 7 scale degrees. So just counting up the scale, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So our note would go on C. It still has the minor chord tone, but it has a little bit of a happier part because the top part of this is an F major chord and the bottom half is still that D minor chord. These types of chords are used more in melodic and pain type of beats. Another chord that's slightly less common but is also used is called a 9th chord. All you're doing is just taking the 7th and just moving it up a couple more scale degrees. So just counting 9 notes up from the root note of your chord. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which puts it on E. Or in other words, it's just an octave up from that 2nd note in the scale. One last modification you can make to a chord is moving this 5th note up 1 half step to a 6th note. Similar to dropping the middle note a half step, this is creating more of a darker vibe. And if you pair both of them together, creates a really dark vibe. Another thing you can do with your chords is take any of these notes here and drop them an octave just to change the voicing of it. So for example, we could take the top note of A here and drop it an octave, or we could take D and move it up an octave. Or we could take 2 notes and drop them. At the end of the day, it's still a D minor triad or D minor chord because we still have the same notes of D, F, and A, or the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes in the scale. They're just being played in different octaves. You can experiment around with the voicings and just see what you really like. Also, if you want to give your chords more depth, you can add notes that are the same notes in the chords but in different octaves. For example, a lot of producers like to take the root note of the chord and copy it down an octave. And you could also take the 5th and copy it down, and maybe the root note and copy it up. So these are all still the same notes in the chord. We're just copying notes up and down octaves to make the chord have a fuller sound. And like I said earlier, all of these principles apply for pretty much every chord in the scale. If you want to apply this with a root note of G, you can do the same exact thing where you're skipping a note. Let's say we want to raise this an octave, or we want to take this and make it a 7th chord. The principle is the same. You're still raising this root note an octave. For a 7th chord, you're still going to go 7 notes up on the scale for the root note. So it doesn't matter what your scale degree is, as long as you're following the same formula, you'll still get a similar type of result. If you want to shift the key of your melody, all you have to do is just move it up or down on the piano roll accordingly. Let's say, for example, if I have this D minor chord and I want to move it up to F sharp minor, all I'm going to do is just shift it until this bottom note hits F sharp. As you can see with the F sharp minor scale and the ghost notes, this now fits that key. Now that we've covered the scales and how to construct chords, I'm now gonna go into chord progressions, specifically some popular chord progressions in songs. The first progression that I wanna cover is the 1-6 progression, or the minor first, major sixth. This progression is really common in Lil Baby beats. Opening up this FLP of a loop that I made recently, I'm just gonna go to the piano bass notes here. We can see it's just the same 3 notes spanned across 3 octaves. So I'm gonna start on the root note of the scale, which is E. So the scale that I'm using for this beat is E minor, and I'm gonna start with the 1, or the root note of the scale, and I'm moving it down to the 6th note. So counting it up, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which takes us to C. Usually the 6th note in this progression is below our root note, so it's just gonna be the same note up here, just dropped down 1 octave. For the sake of giving these bass notes more depth, I just copied them to multiple octaves. In some of Lil Baby's beats, sometimes at the end for the last measure or half a measure or so, what they'll do is move these notes up to the 7th note in the scale, or just 1 scale degree up from the 6th note. All this does is just make it more cohesive and kind of lead it back to the root note. So putting in context with the rest of the loop, this is what it sounds like. So now moving on to the next type of chord progression, which is really prominent in pain beats. This works for artists like Lil Durk and Rod Wave. So going into this project file, I'm gonna open up my chord progression here, and this beat was made in D sharp minor. Usually how I'll make these sort of pain melodies is I'll start by picturing out the bass notes first. So the chord progression for this beat is 1, 7, 6. Specifically for D sharp minor, it's D sharp, C sharp, and B. Similar to the 4PF beat, at the end I turn it around by using the 7 again to lead it back into the first note in the scale. This is constructed pretty similarly to the last one, where we start off with the root note and lead it down to the 6th note in the scale. This time we're going to flesh it out with chords and also put a little more emphasis on that 7th note in the scale. So constructing this type of bass pattern from scratch, I'm going to start off with my root note of D sharp and then count up 7 notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, place 1 on C sharp, and then I'm going to move it down to the 6th note in the scale, which is 1 below at B. Similar to the last chord progression that we discussed, these notes are usually dropped in octaves so that they're below the root note. So bringing the chords back, using knowledge of both the scales and constructing chords, I have a D sharp minor triad, or a regular D sharp minor chord. We get D sharp, skip F, place a note on F sharp, then skip G sharp and place a note on A sharp. So we just have a basic chord here. Moving on to this chord that starts with C sharp, we start off with C sharp, skip D sharp, place a note on F, skip F sharp, place a note on C sharp, which gives us a C sharp major chord because the middle note's a little higher. Then moving to this last chord here, we have 4 notes instead of 3. So it's the same formula. First note, skip, middle note, skip, 3rd note. This is a B major 7 chord because we have the 7th note relative to this first note. So my root note of this specific chord is B. And if we count up 7 notes in the scale, we get A sharp. So this is the relative 7th note to this note down here. It's 7 notes up in the scale from the root note of B. And this kind of creates an inverse effect from the minor 7th chord to the major 7th. So the bottom part of the note is a major chord, and then the top part of the note is a minor chord. We move on to the 4th measure, which is just a copy of our 2nd chord here, which goes back into the original 1st note. So in context with the rest of the loop, it sounds something like this. So now moving on to the next chord progression, which is the 1-4 chord progression. And similar to the last one, it's pretty self-explanatory. We're starting with a root note and then moving up to the 4th note in the scale and building chords off of those. This is used in a lot of different subgenres of rap. This is used in kind of more like ambient synth type of beats for artists like Travis Scott. It's also used in some more melodic trap beats. Guys like Q Beats, Vinyls, and Alan Ritter use this chord progression a lot for artists like Drake and Future. It's also used a lot in West Coast music. I'll go through a few different project files that has the same chord progression, and it'll kind of make sense in context with each different genre. The first one I want to cover is the kind of synth vibe in Travis Scott type of songs. This melody was made using the G minor scale, and I have that pulled up in the ghost notes. As the name of the progression entails, we started with the root note or the first note in the scale and just made a basic minor chord. So same recipe, 1, 3, 5. It may not be immediately obvious, but this is the chord of the fourth note in the scale. It'll make a little more sense if I move this up an octave. Fourth note in the scale right here, which is C. So if we count it up from the root note, it's 4 notes up. And then we use the same recipe, skip a note, place 1, skip a note, place 1. And in the final melody, it's just a different voicing of this chord by just taking this top note and dropping an octave. And then I just took that and copied it over here. So it's a really simple chord progression, and it just leads really well back into the root note. So now going to the West Coast variation of this chord progression. So pulling up this melody, you can clearly see the 1-4 chord progression in this one. So along with the previous construction that I showed y'all of making this chord progression, all you'd have to do to just make this normally is you just take your normal chord and copy it over and then just move it up 5 half steps. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as you can see, it fits with the scale. It's the same chord that I had before. So the chords by themselves sound something like this. And then throw in all the top notes and the rest of the melody with it. It sounds something like this. So now moving on to the more melodic Q beats type of styling of this chord progression. So I have this Spanish guitar open, and as you can tell, it's the same progression that I've showed y'all on the last couple beats. So I just have this first arpeggiated chord here, where it's just using the D sharp minor chord, D sharp, F sharp, and A sharp. Then I copied that over and then just moved it up 5 half steps. And I pretty much just have this playing for the whole 4 measures. And that's literally the basis of this entire loop. So like I said earlier, this is a super simple chord progression, but it has many different ways of voicing it, so it's pretty cool. You could experiment around with different sound selections, tempos, and styles, but this is a pretty universal chord progression. So now moving on to the next chord progression, which is the 1-5-6 chord progression. This is used a lot in more of that kind of like new age virtual type of sound. To be more specific, it's used in beats for artists like Yeat, Destroy Lonely, Ken Carson, Playboy Cardi, those types of vibes. Going into this project file, I have these chords right here. So putting the scale behind the notes here. So for this melody, I used the D minor scale. So I started with the root note of D, or the 1. Then I moved it down to the 5th note in the scale. Counting it backwards, we could go 1, 7, 6, 5, or count it up and then drop it an octave. Then I used the 6th note in the scale, which is just 1 half step up from the 5th note. And just using those, I just built some chords on top of it and then copied it over to the 2nd half here. And then I also just threw in the 7th note in the scale too, just to kind of lead it back in and add a little variation to this pattern. So this progression is not as rigid as the other ones. You could change the order of these. You could go 1, 6, 5, or you could go 1, 6, 7, or 1, 5, 7, or 1, 4, 5, but just some sort of variation of it. But usually this is the most common one, where it's 1, 5, 6. But this melody by itself sounds something like this. And putting it in context with the rest of the loop, it sounds something like this. So now moving on to the last progression, if you even want to call it that, only using the first note in the scale as a root note. So for the most part, this is used for dark beats. Your goal with this is you want to make the chords dark, not with the root note, but with the accessory notes. So this pattern right here is using the E minor scale. As you can tell on the bottom here, I just have the root note E repeated over and over again. I'm just using the 1st and 3rd note in the scale, and I'm just kind of omitting this top note here. I have the same thing I copied over. To make these chords darker, what you do is just take this middle note and drop it a half step. So it sounds kind of like this. I have that repeating again. In the last measure, I have the 6th and 5th note in the scale, which creates more of that dark vibe. So that wraps up the popular chord progressions. None of these are used 100% of the time. You can play around with different bass notes and all that, but these are just good places to start if you want to make those types of beats. So now we've discussed how we construct our chords, the the popular chord progressions. Now we're going to go into how to construct your top melodies. So generally when I make my top melodies, I kind of sort it into one of two different categories. The first being a more melodic type of sound, and the second being a more dark and mysterious vibe. So I'll cover what's entailed in the more melodic side of things first. So going back into this FLP where I was showing y'all 1/6 chord progression for the Lil Baby type of melodies. So going into the top melody here, I pulled up the scale behind it. So again, we're using the E minor scale, so our root note is here at E. For the sake of explanation, I'll drop these top notes in octaves so it makes a little more sense. So if we're looking at the notes being used, so the primary notes in the scale that are being used are the first, third, fourth, fifth, and seventh notes in the scale. The reason I didn't use the 6 notes in the scale is because those are usually used to make a more dark vibe. That doesn't mean you can't use them whatsoever, but generally these notes together have a more melodic feel to it. The reason why the 2nd and 6th notes create that dark vibe is because notes that are right next to each other on the piano roll or a half step apart, they usually create tension or dissonance within the melodies, which creates that dark vibe to it. So if I take all these notes and just put it up an octave, that's how I ended up getting the final melody. And going to the Lil Durk Rod Wave FLP, the same applies here when it comes to the notes that you would use for counter melodies. So if I open up the pattern that has the piano counter melody, if we look at the notes, it's pretty much the same thing again. The only difference this time is I'm including the 2nd note in the scale. In this context, this works. Again, this is not an absolute rule where you can't use the 2nd and 6th notes. I just find it that in most of my melodies, I usually don't use the 6th note in the scale, but sometimes I'll still use the 2nd note. Outside of the chords, I don't use the 6th note in the scale because it doesn't really go along with the whole melodic vibe. So if I moved all these A sharp notes up to B, this is kind of what the pattern would sound like. So if I move this back down to the 5th note in the scale, it sounds something more like this. Definitely a lot more appealing to hear with the overall vibe of the beat. Even in the saxophone melody, you can see using pretty much every single note in the scale except for the 6th note. And I'll demonstrate again by moving all these A sharp up to B. So it's technically in the key, but it just doesn't really sound good with the rest of the beat. So those were a couple examples of the melodic counter melodies. So now going into this FLP where I have a dark sample, I'll just play the melody real quick and I'll go in afterwards and explain the differences. So for this melody, I'm using the same key of D sharp minor. The primary difference between this and the melodic beat is that this one heavily uses these notes that are spaced a half step apart from each other. Like I said earlier, this creates a more darker vibe, so you'd want to use it for a darker beat. Also notice I don't even use the 7th note in the scale whatsoever. In the melodic counter melodies, I didn't use the 6th note at all, and I used the 7th note quite a bit. And now here in the darker melodies, I'm not using the 7th note at all, but I'm using the 6th note. So even if I go into the original pattern for this melody, you can see that I'm using the 6th note pretty heavily throughout it, especially the 5th and 6th pairing. If I moved it up to the 7th, it would sound more melodic versus a 6th note. So overall, the primary difference between your dark counter melodies and your melodic counter melodies is that the dark counter melodies are going to use pretty much all the notes in the scale except for the 7th note, and your melodic counter melodies are going to use all the notes except for the 6th note. Now we've pretty much got all the melodies and all that out of the way. Just a little bonus, I'm going to show y'all a couple different ways that you could find the root notes or the key of your sample. The first method is probably the most well-known method, where you just go in and you play your sample and you just have your 808 track open and you just keep playing around with the notes until you get one that sounds correct. So that sounds about right. And if your bass notes are switching between different notes, what you could do is just go up here and just keep playing with the notes until it hits the right pitch. I just keep repeating the process until I figure out what my next bass note is. Another method that you could use is go to a website called TuneBat or any other similar website and go to key and BPM finder. And all you do is just go and drop your file in and it'll give you BPM or key. Sometimes these might be a little bit off, so take it with a grain of salt if it doesn't sound correct. And going back into the project file, if I reset this pitch and go to my 808s, we can see that F is actually the original key of this. And one last method that I sometimes use for this, I'll go to the mixer track that my melody's on and I'll open up this plugin called Auto Key. It's made by the same people that make Auto-Tune. Similar to TuneBat, it's usually correct, but sometimes it might be a little bit off. Anyways, that's gonna wrap it up for this one. I hope y'all found it pretty helpful, and overall that's pretty much my entire knowledge base of music theory. So if you found it pretty helpful, be sure to leave a like, and that's gonna wrap it up for me. So I'll see you on the next video.